The ship arrived on a Tuesday, which Rio would later tell people was the most offensive part of the whole thing. Not a Friday, when the city was loose and electric and something extraordinary might at least feel appropriate. Tuesday. The sort of day that existed purely to remind you that Monday had not, in fact, been the worst day of the week. He had been behind his cart on the eastern edge of Ueno Park, 40 meters from the pond, running his second-worst takoyaki batch of the month. The batter was slightly too thin. He knew it. He'd known it when he mixed it, but he'd been out of the good flour and hadn't wanted to go back to the supplier until Thursday. So here he was, turning slightly substandard octopus balls in their molds, while a pair of pigeons stared at him with expressions that could only be described as professionally disappointed. The shadow came first. Not dramatic darkness, not the blotting out of the sun the way it happened in films. Just a cool, lateral shadow that moved against the wind, and Rio looked up because shadows weren't supposed to do that. The thing descending over Ueno was not large in the way he'd expected. He had grown up watching American movies where alien ships were the size of cities, where they blotted out whole skylines and cast Los Angeles into permanent twilight. This one was perhaps the size of a department store. An upscale department store, he would later clarify, not one of the discount places. It was shaped like nothing he had a word for. Not a disc, not a cylinder, not any of the geometric primaries his brain kept trying to impose on it. It seemed to have a preferred number of dimensions that was not 3. It was the color of the inside of a wave. It landed in the northern section of the park with a sound like a very large library achieving sudden silence. Rio stood with his turning stick in his hand and watched this happen. Then he looked down at his takoyaki. The batter had seized slightly, which was actually an improvement. He looked back at the ship. He looked at his takoyaki again. "Of course," he said, to no one in particular, and turned off the heat element under his cart, because even if the world was ending, there was no reason to burn the batch. The first 20 minutes were pure chaos, and Rio watched it from where he'd sat down on the retaining wall near the pond, eating one of his own takoyaki and revising downward his assessment of the batch. It was actually fine. Not his best work, but the texture in the center was decent. People ran. That was the dominant activity. They ran in several directions simultaneously, which created interesting traffic problems at the park's intersections. A group of tourists from somewhere that prized maintaining group cohesion above individual survival instincts ran in a tight cluster toward the southern exit and got jammed in the gate like a badly shuffled deck of cards. A man in a business suit stood completely still for approximately 45 seconds, then sat down on the grass and began composing what appeared to be a very long text message. 2 children, maybe 7 years old, ran toward the ship rather than away from it, and Rio noted with something approaching respect that their parents caught them, but it took a while. The ship did nothing. It simply was, with the complete, unself-conscious presence of a mountain or a large appliance. Rio ate his takoyaki and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was sirens. Then helicopters. Then, roughly 40 minutes after the landing, a perimeter of police vehicles that expanded in neat rings outward from the ship, pushing everyone back except for Rio, who had somehow ended up inside the first perimeter before anyone thought to establish it, and who found that the police officers establishing the outer rings assumed he'd been cleared by the officers at the inner rings, and the officers at the inner rings assumed he was some kind of journalist or researcher because he had a clipboard that had been on his cart for 3 weeks containing his supplier invoices. Nobody asked him to leave. He ate the rest of his takoyaki. The ship was about 30 meters away. It did not look like anything. This was the thing that kept striking him, not that it looked alien or strange or threatening, but that it refused to resolve into an image his brain could file anywhere. Every time he thought he'd understood its shape, the shape turned out to be something different. It wasn't that it was moving. It was that his perception of it kept revising itself, kept surfacing new corrections, like he was trying to read a sentence in a language that kept reshuffling its own grammar. He was staring at it, trying to figure out whether it had a door, when something happened inside his head. It wasn't painful. He wanted to be clear about that later, when people asked. It wasn't painful, and it wasn't like hearing a voice, and it wasn't like seeing an image with his eyes. It was more like, he struggled with this for weeks afterward, it was more like when you suddenly, fully remember something you'd completely forgotten. Not remembering in the sense of accessing stored information. The feeling itself. The quality of the memory flooding back. Except what flooded in wasn't his. He was standing in water. Not standing, He didn't have a body. He was distributed through water, long threads of himself stretching through something cold and dark and enormous. He was old. Old wasn't even the right word. He was so old that the concept of oldness had become circular, had looped back around into a kind of permanent present tense. Around him, through him, above and below him in directions that didn't map to up and down, there were others. He couldn't see them or hear them, but he knew them the way you know your own hands without looking. They were patient. They were all patient in the same way, the way that things become patient when they've been at something long enough that impatience would be absurd. Then it was gone. He was standing in Ueno Park, 43 minutes into what would later be called the most significant event in human history, holding an empty takoyaki wrapper. "Okay," Rio said. He sat back down on the retaining wall. He thought about what he'd just experienced with the careful, slightly sideways attention he gave to things that didn't fit neatly into categories. He was 19 years old. He had not finished high school, a fact his mother mentioned with decreasing frequency as she had begun to accept that it was simply a permanent feature of their family landscape, like the water stain on the ceiling of their apartment and the complicated feelings everyone had about his father's side of the family. He sold takoyaki in Ueno Park 6 days a week and had been doing so since he was 17, and he felt, reasonably good at it. He was also now, apparently, the person an alien was talking to. He wasn't sure how he knew this. He knew it the way he knew the takoyaki batter was off before he'd even finished mixing it. Not a specific thought, but a quality of certainty that occupied a different layer than thinking. He folded the wrapper carefully and put it in his pocket. The first contact team arrived at hour 3. Rio knew they were the first contact team because their vehicles had a specific kind of authority to them, different from the police and the self-defense force units that had been arriving steadily. These vehicles moved like they were expected, like the city had been cleared specifically for them, which it had been, in ways Rio wouldn't learn about until much later. There were 6 vehicles, matte gray, no visible insignia, and from them emerged people with the specific posture of individuals who had trained for something for a very long time and were now doing it for the first time and were trying very hard not to let on that their hands were shaking. There was a woman at the front who was clearly in charge. She was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had been handsome for so long it had become something more architectural than personal. She wore a suit that seemed to absorb light in a practical way, and she carried nothing, which in Rio's experience meant you either worked for the government or you were very rich. She walked directly toward the ship and then, perhaps 3 meters from the hull, stopped. Nothing happened for a moment. Then her head tilted slightly to one side, the way people's heads tilted when they heard something unexpected. Then she stepped back very quickly, 3 full steps, and spoke rapidly into a device at her collar. This, Rio would learn, was what the first contact protocol described as preliminary reception, the initial approach by the designated lead contact, who would attempt to establish the existence of communication, assess the alien's capacity for response, and begin the painstaking process of identifying shared mathematical or physical constants that could serve as a baseline for eventual language. What had actually happened, he would also learn later, was that Dr. Yuki Aramori, Director of First Contact Operations, lead contact for the Western Pacific Zone, holder of 2 doctorates and the chair of 3 international bodies dedicated specifically to this moment, had gotten within 3 meters of the ship and had experienced 45 seconds of another creature's memory so overwhelming and disorienting that she'd needed to step back and breathe. She had experienced, apparently, the interior of a dying star. Rio watched this from the retaining wall, where he was still sitting. A young man in tactical clothing had come over at hour 2 and asked him several times to move back, and Rio had explained that he couldn't move back because his cart was here, and the young man had gone to confer with someone, and nobody had come back, so Rio had stayed. Dr. Aramori's team formed a rapid huddle. Rio watched the huddle, which had the energy of people reconfiguring their entire understanding of a situation and doing so at speed. Equipment came out of the vehicles. Sensing equipment, Rio assumed, the kind of things you brought to measure and assess something you couldn't directly approach. Then the head of the huddle turned and looked at him. Not at the general area where he was sitting. At him specifically. Rio pointed at himself. The head of the huddle, who turned out to be a tall man named Dr. Hashimoto Kenji, walked over with an expression that suggested he was actively suppressing a number of strong feelings. "You were here when it landed?" he asked. "I was making takoyaki," Rio said. Dr. Hashimoto looked at the cart. Then at Rio. "And it communicated with you?" "I don't know if communicated is the right word. It showed me something. What did it show you? Rio thought about the water, the cold, the enormous patience. Being very old in a large ocean, he said. Dr. Hashimoto stared at him for a moment. How old are you? 19. The expression on Dr. Hashimoto's face was one Rio would see many times in the following days, and he came to think of it as the protocol face, the look of someone whose 200-year-old plan had just met reality and was trying to figure out which parts of the plan still applied. Would you be willing to approach the ship again? Rio looked at the ship. It looked back at him in its way that wasn't looking but was something else, something that occupied the same conceptual space as attention without using any of the same mechanisms. Sure, he said. He got to about 2 meters before the next memory arrived. This one was longer. He was somewhere that had 2 suns, and he was made differently. Here, he had the impression of a body that was less a fixed object than a process, something that maintained its shape through ongoing effort the way a flame maintains its shape. Around him, from him, were young ones. The concept of young arrived loaded, arrived with a kind of ache that wasn't sadness but was related to sadness the way cousins are related, the same bone structure, different expressions. He was showing them something. Teaching them, though teaching wasn't quite right either. He was sharing the shape of an experience the way you might share food, not the fact of it but the texture. Then he was back in the park. He stood there for a moment. Behind him, at a safe distance, 43 people with advanced degrees and specialized training and equipment worth somewhere in the region of $800 million waited to hear what the alien had said. Rio turned around. It was showing me its children, he said. Or something like children. The ones it's responsible for. It was showing me what that feels like. A very long silence. Dr. Aramori, who had rejoined the group after recovering from her experience, looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. "Why you?" she asked. Not unkindly. "I don't know," he said. "I was the closest one when it landed. Others have been within 2 meters. "Not me close," Rio said, and then felt stupid because he couldn't explain what he meant, and the look on her face suggested she understood anyway. They set him up with a microphone and a team of people listening and recording everything he said when he came back from the ship. They gave him a headset and a chair and something that was described as a debrief tent but was, structurally, exactly a tent. Someone brought him tea without asking if he wanted tea, which he appreciated. Someone else brought him a form to sign. He signed the form. "What does this say?" he asked, after signing it. "Non-disclosure," said the woman who'd brought it. "I already signed it." "Yes." "Okay," he said. Dr. Hashimoto sat across from him with a tablet and the expression of a man trying to integrate a very large amount of new information while maintaining the appearance of having integrated it already. "When it communicates," he said, choosing his words with evident care, "does it seem like it's trying to say something specific? Is there a message?" Rio thought about this. "It's not like a message," he said. "It's more like, you know when someone is very sad and they can't explain it, and so instead they show you a photograph? It's like that. Except instead of a photograph, it's the actual experience." Dr. Hashimoto typed something. "What is it trying to achieve?" asked Dr. Aramori from the corner of the tent, where she had been standing very still for the past 10 minutes. Rio considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think it wants to be understood," he said. Not like it wants us to comprehend its civilization or learn its history. More like someone who has been alone for a long time and wants someone to know what it's like to be them." The silence in the tent had a specific quality. "How alone?" Dr. Aramori asked. Rio looked at the tent ceiling. "Very alone," he said. "Like the kind of alone where you stop thinking of alone as a bad thing and start thinking of it as just what everything is." On the second day they tried the protocol. He watched from the tent while they ran through the opening sequence, the prime number display, the mathematical constants projected in light on panels they'd set up at the ship. Perimeter, the sequences of physical demonstrations they'd spent a century and a half perfecting. The idea, Dr. Hashimoto had explained the previous evening with the slightly pained patience of a man summarizing something that had occupied his entire professional life, was to establish a shared framework. Find the common ground. Mathematics transcended language, transcended biology, transcended the accident of evolutionary history. 2 and 2 were 4 in any conceivable universe. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter was the same on Earth as it was on any world circling any star. Start there. Build up. The ship regarded the mathematical displays with what Rio, watching from 40 meters away, could only describe as polite indifference. Not hostility. Not incomprehension. Just a kind of gentle waiting. Like it was sitting with you while you did something it had moved past a long time ago. Dr. Aramori came to the tent. It's not responding to any of the stimuli, she said. I know, said Rio. It's only responding to you. I know. She sat down across from him. In the daylight she looked less architectural and more tired. He suspected she hadn't slept. I want you to understand, she said, that everything we're asking you to do is voluntary. You can stop at any point. We have a full psychological support team and... I'm fine, Rio said. You've experienced 2 episodes of... They weren't bad, he said. They were intense, but they weren't bad. It's not trying to hurt me. It's trying to talk to me. He paused. It's actually kind of interesting. She looked at him with an expression he was beginning to classify as academic concern, which was different from regular concern in that it contained an extra layer of something almost like professional envy. What's it like? She asked. Not as a researcher. As a person. Rio thought about the water. The 2 sons. The children that were not children. You know when you read a really good book, he said, and you finish it and you're sad because you have to stop being the person you were while you were reading it? It's a bit like that. Except instead of reading it, you were briefly a completely different kind of being, and now you're back to being yourself, and yourself feels a bit small. Dr. Aramori was quiet for a long moment. You'd be wasted in food service, she said finally. The takoyaki is genuinely good, Rio said. On the 3rd day, he started trying to talk back. This hadn't been in anyone's plan. The protocol had exactly nothing to say about reciprocal memory transmission, because the protocol had been built on the assumption of a being that communicated externally, in signals or language or gesture. The protocol had a beautiful, intricate framework for what to do when an alien spoke. It had no framework for what to do when an alien looked at you with something that wasn't eyes and showed you the inside of its oldest memory. So Rio improvised. He stood 2 meters from the hull and closed his eyes and thought about the thing he knew most thoroughly, the thing he understood from the inside out the way the alien seemed to understand its water and its ancient ocean. He thought about standing behind the cart at 5 in the morning when the park was still dark and the city was almost quiet, the way the cold air smelled different from afternoon air, the specific solitude of being up before the world, the rhythm of the preparation, the batter mixed and resting, the pan heating, the way you knew by sound and by the faint smell when the oil was at exactly the right temperature. He thought about how he'd learned from his grandmother the specific position of her hands on the turning stick, and how now when he turned the balls he could feel her hands over his like a ghost, like memory made physical. He thought about being alone in the pre-dawn city and not minding it, because the aloneness was full of small things, the pond light, the distant trains, the pigeons waking up, the particular quality of a city that is paused between one day and the next and belongs briefly to nobody. He thought about being 19 and not knowing what he was going to do but not being particularly frightened of not knowing, because not knowing felt less like a deficiency and more like a door. He opened his eyes. For a moment nothing happened. Then the thing arrived in his mind, and it was different from the previous ones. It was not a memory of a place or a body or a state of being. It was something that translated, imperfectly, as recognition, as the sensation of finding, after a very long time searching, not an answer, but a match. The way a key feels when it meets the right lock. The particular quality of a resonance. It was the briefest of all the communications. It lasted less than a second. Rio stood in front of the ship and breathed. Then he started crying, which surprised him, and he turned away from the ship so the cameras wouldn't catch it, except of course all the cameras caught it, and the footage would be studied for years. Dr. Aramori asked him afterward, quietly, what had happened. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. I think I said something and it hurt me, he said. Not the content. The fact of it. He paused, trying to find the words. You know when you're talking to someone and you're not sure if they're actually listening or just waiting for you to stop. And then they say something and you realize they were actually hearing you the whole time. She nodded. It was like that. It was like it heard me. Not what I said, but that I said it. That I tried. She was quiet for a moment. Then, do you think it understands us? Humanity, I mean. What we are. Rio considered. He thought about all the things the ship had shown him, the age, the ocean, the children, the twin suns. He thought about the long patience of a thing that had been in the universe long enough to lose the habit of urgency. I think it understands us the way we understand, he paused, searching for the right comparison, the way we understand ants, he said. Not like ants are stupid. Like ants are small and quick, and they have their whole civilization going on, and we can't really see the details of it. We can only see the shape of what they're doing. And it doesn't make them less, it just means the scale is different. That's not a comforting thought. I didn't say it was comforting. He looked at the ship. But I think it thinks we're interesting. The way you might be interested in ants. Not because you want to study them or use them. Just because you find yourself watching them and you're not sure why, but you keep watching. On the fourth day, the governments became involved at a level that made the previous governmental involvement look like a neighborhood committee meeting. Rio had a new tent with better furniture and was introduced to 3 people whose titles were long enough to wrap around a small building, and he sat in meetings where people said things like strategic communication vector and first-order phenomenological contact and reciprocal empathic resonance, and he drank a great deal of the very good tea they kept bringing him and said, yes, and I'll try, at appropriate intervals. His mother called. He had been updating her daily, which she'd been receiving with a specific brand of maternal alarm that presents as practical concern. She'd wanted to know if he was eating. He was. She'd wanted to know if he was sleeping. He was, in a cot they'd set up in the back section of the debrief tent. She'd wanted to know if the aliens were going to eat him or enslave humanity or do any of the things aliens did in the drama serials she watched on weekend evenings. He'd told her he didn't think so. Rio, she said on the 4th day, your cart is still in the park. I know. Someone should bring it back. I'll ask someone. Also, she said, and her voice shifted into the register she used when she was about to say something she'd been sitting on for a while, I've been thinking about what you told me. The memories it showed you. Yeah. The part about being in the water. Very old. Not alone, but the way you described it. Like being part of something. Yeah. That doesn't sound bad, she said. Rio looked at the ceiling of the tent, which had a small imperfection near one of the support poles where the fabric had been repaired. No, he said. It doesn't. On the 5th day, the ship showed him its journey. He was standing at his usual distance, in the early morning before the full-day team arrived. Just him and 2 security personnel who had long since adopted the attitude of people who had accepted that their post was unusual and were making the best of it. The park was cool and the pond was silver and the ship was being the ship, which was its full-time occupation. The memory that arrived was not one memory but many, laid over each other like transparencies, and the combined effect was something that had no human equivalent that Rio could find. He understood, in the way he understood all the communications, not with his brain's language centers but with something older and less articulate, that the being in the ship was showing him the distance it had traveled. Not distance in kilometers. Distance as experience. He felt, briefly, imperfectly, like a radio tuned to a signal from very far away, what it was to move through space on a scale that made solar systems small. The loneliness of it, if loneliness was even the word, because the loneliness was so old and so total that it had become something else, something that sat in the same emotional neighborhood as loneliness but had a completely different flavor. He felt the weight of having started this journey from a place that no longer existed, not because it had been destroyed but because so much time had passed that existing and not existing had blurred at the edges. He felt the specific quality of purpose that sustained the journey. Not a destination, not a goal, but a question. A question so fundamental it had long ago stopped being a question and become instead a kind of orientation, the way a compass points not because it wants to go anywhere but because that is what it is. And underneath all of it, threaded through it like the smell of something familiar in an unfamiliar place, was the thing that had made it come here. The thing that was in the faint, leaking edge of Earth's information sphere that had reached into interstellar space and caught the attention of something unimaginably old. Rio came back. He stood in the cool morning park and breathed. Then he turned to the security officer nearest him, a woman named Sergeant Ueno who had given up pretending to be neutral about the whole situation somewhere around day 2 and now just watched everything with open, careful interest. "Sergeant," he said. "Yes. Do you know why it came here specifically?" "No," she said. "I think I do now." He looked at the ship. "I think it heard us. Not language. Just the frequency of all of us. The fact of consciousness. The fact of things asking questions about themselves and each other." He paused. "I think that's rare. Wherever it's from. I think it's rarer than we think." Sergeant Ono looked at the ship for a long moment. "That's," she started, and then stopped, because there wasn't a word for what that was. "Yeah," said Rio. The linguists had a breakthrough on day 6, which turned out to be not really a breakthrough but more of a paradigm shift, which was both more and less useful depending on what you'd been hoping for. What they established, after 5 days of analysis, was that the ship did not communicate in anything that functioned like language. Not any form of language, not even the underlying logical structures that all known languages shared. What it used instead was, as far as they could tell, direct experiential transmission, the consciousness equivalent of a blood transfusion. You didn't receive information. You received being. This meant the protocol, the beautiful, intricate, 200-year-old protocol with its mathematical progressions and its careful staged introductions and its fallback procedures and its contingencies upon contingencies, was not wrong, exactly. It had been designed for a form of communication that simply hadn't shown up. It was the most sophisticated plan ever made for an event that had decided to be an entirely different event. Dr. Hashimoto, to his credit, handled this with more equanimity than Rio had expected. He sat in the main operations tent with a mug of coffee and looked at his tablet for a long time. "The question," he said finally, to no one in particular, "is whether the protocol can be adapted." "I don't think it can," said Dr. Aramori from across the tent. "No," he agreed. "I don't think it can either." A silence. "The other question," he said, "is whether we're okay with a 19-year-old takoyaki vendor being the primary interface between humanity and its first confirmed extraterrestrial contact." Another silence, longer and with a different texture. "His grandmother taught him to cook," Dr. Aramori said. "He told me. He thinks about her when he's working. He thinks about the park in the early morning. He thinks about—" she paused. "He thinks about not knowing what he's going to do with his life, and not being afraid of that." Hashimoto looked at her. "I think those are the right things," she said. "For this." Rio spent hour after hour at the ship over the following days, not trying to achieve anything in particular, which was the only thing that worked. Every time someone came to him with a list of things they wanted him to try to communicate, or extract, or ask, the communications either didn't come or came and were something else entirely. When he went to the ship with nothing in particular on his mind, just the presence of himself and his ordinary half-formed thoughts and memories, the ship spoke. It showed him what stars looked like from outside a galaxy, not as light, not as image, but as a kind of music you felt in a part of yourself that you didn't ordinarily feel things in. It showed him the experience of existing without a body, not as a disability but as a different topology, a different relationship between self and the surrounding universe, the way a river is differently shaped than a lake but neither is less than the other. It showed him the death of something, once, or what death was like from the inside, which was nothing like he'd expected, was instead a gradual widening, a slow relaxation of the boundary between self and not self, like a drawing whose edges softly faded until the drawing was the page and the page was the drawing. He started going in the evenings too, when the light was lower and the park was quieter and the equipment teams had fewer people on duty. He stood 2 meters from the thing that had crossed distances that made the entire span of human history look like a Tuesday afternoon, and he thought about things, about his grandmother's hands, about the particular joy of a batch that came out right, about the way the pond light moved in the morning, about being 19 and full of the particular kind of hope that doesn't know yet that it's hope. And the ship listened. He could feel it listening. Not with instruments, not with anything physical, but in the same way you can feel, in a conversation, the moment when the other person stops waiting for their turn to speak and actually starts hearing you. On the 9th day, it showed him something he spent the rest of his life trying to describe accurately, and never entirely succeeded. He was at the ship in the late afternoon, when the autumn light came through the trees at a low angle and made the park look like a place that existed specifically to be remembered. The security team had become accustomed to giving him space, and he stood alone in the small cleared area closest to the hull and let his mind do what it did, which on that particular day was think about nothing consequential, the texture of the afternoon, the smell of the park, the odd domesticity of having a space heater in the debrief tent that made a small clicking sound when it cycled on. The communication that came was not a memory. He stood in it for what felt like a long time and was probably, by external clock, about 30 seconds. Afterward, he walked back to the tent and sat down and looked at the table for a while. Dr. Aramori came in, saw his face, sat down across from him, and waited. After a while she asked, quietly, "What was it?" Rio thought about how to answer this. "It showed me what it sees when it looks at us," he said. "All of us. Earth. Everything on it." He stopped. "It's not like how I thought it would be. It's not like, distant, or scientific. It's more like," he looked for the word. "You know when you find something really small and alive and you're not sure what it is, but you look at it for a long time? And there's this feeling that you're seeing something that doesn't know it's being seen, and that there's something perfect about that the not knowing is part of what makes it." He stopped again. "Precious," said Dr. Aramori. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "Precious." He sat with this word for a moment. "It thinks we're precious." The silence in the tent was complete and very warm. "Not in a, I want to protect you or study you way," he added. "More in a, you know when you see light on water? And it only lasts for a second, and if you try to hold on to it, it would stop being what it is. It's like that." He traced a shape on the table with his finger, not any particular shape. "We're brief," he said. "Everything about us is brief. And it's been around long enough to know that brief things have a specific kind of light. That long things don't." Dr. Aramori was quiet for a long time. "I'm going to need you to write that down," she said finally. "I know," said Rio. On the 12th day, the ship began what the team would later call the departure sequence, which mostly involved it doing the same thing it always did except with a barely perceptible quality of preparation, like someone picking up their coat at the end of a visit. Rio spent more time at the hull. The communications came faster now, less distinct from each other, layered and complex the way the last conversations with someone are always more compressed than the earlier ones, packed with everything that still needs saying before it's time to go. He received the memory of silence so vast and old that silence had lost all negative connotation and become simply the medium through which everything else moved, like water. He received the concept of gratitude in a form that had no words but had a texture, warm and undemanding, the way sunlight felt on your face when you weren't looking for it. He received something he would not talk about publicly, would only ever mention in a letter to his mother years later, which was the sensation of being known, not understood, not analyzed, but known, by something that had seen everything and found nothing to discard. On the morning of the 14th day, a group of 30 scientists and diplomats and military advisors and support staff stood at the edge of the cleared perimeter and watched Rio Nakata, 19 years old, third-generation Tokyoite, purveyor of reasonably good takoyaki, walk to within arm's reach of the ship. He stood there for a long time. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't do anything in particular. He just stood there, present in the specific, unspectacular way he'd always been present, the way he was present behind his cart in the pre-dawn park, the way he was present in his small apartment, the way he was present in all the ordinary, unremarkable moments that made up a life that was, by any external measure, not particularly extraordinary. The ship showed him one last thing. It was not a place or a being or a state. It was a gesture, a motion in a space that wasn't physical. He didn't have a name for it and would spend years looking for an approximation. The closest he ever got, years later, in a long interview he gave reluctantly to a journalist he liked, "You know when you're leaving somewhere and you look back? Not because you forgot something, just because you want to look back. Because you want the place to know you looked back." He stood there. The ship departed slowly, not dramatically, not with the roar and light and concussive force the disaster preparedness teams had spent 3 weeks modeling. It simply, gradually, stopped being there, not moving away so much as ceasing to occupy the space it had been occupying, as though it had been temporarily borrowing the location and had now returned it. The process took about 4 minutes, which nobody had predicted, and at no point was it clear which second was the last second before it was gone and which was the first second after. And then the space it had occupied was just the space it had occupied, a patch of Ueno Park, autumn dry and flat, with the pond nearby and the trees beyond the pond doing what trees did, which was exactly what they always did, which was stand there and be trees. Rio stood in the empty space for a moment. Then he walked back to where his cart was, which the security team had quietly wheeled back into position 2 days ago without being asked, and he checked the equipment, and the flour was fresh because someone had replaced it, and he began to mix the batter. Dr. Aramori came and stood near the cart, not asking anything. Dr. Hashimoto came and stood near her. One by one, in the way that people who have shared something enormous find each other in its aftermath, the team assembled near the cart. The batter was good. He knew it by the feel of it. He got the pan to temperature, checked the oil by the sound, began to fill the molds. Above the park, above the pond, above the city, the autumn sky was completely ordinary, which was a thing it had always been and would always be, and which was, Rio thought, as he turned the first batch at the precise right moment, exactly the right kind of thing for a sky to be. He cooked the takoyaki. They were, by general consensus among people who were too shaken to have normal opinions about food, the best they had ever tasted. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.